For those of you who don't know, I'm Professor Fiona Devine and I am Head of Alliance Manchester Business School here at the University of Manchester. And it does give me enormous pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's event. So obviously for all of you here in person, thank you very much for joining us. But then I know that we have an audience online, and thank you to the audience online for joining us. So I'm delighted that we are joined this afternoon, by Stian Westlake, who is currently CEO of the Royal Statistical Society and also incoming chair of the UKRI's Economic and Social Research Council. Now, Stian is co-author of Capitalism Without Capital, a critically acclaimed book on intangible investment. He has also recently co-authored Restarting the Future, a book about what has gone wrong with the modern economy and how to fix it. Stian's research is centered around the economic and politics of innovation, research, and technology. He is a regular commentator on science and innovation policy and has served as an advisor to 3 British Prime Ministers for science, innovation, research, and higher education. Before that, he led a 50-person policy and research team at Nesta, the UK's National Foundation for Innovation. Early in Stian's career, he worked as a strategy consultant specializing in healthcare, technology, and corporate and infrastructure finance. He also made and managed investments for a social venture fund and worked as a policy advisor at the HM Treasury. He has been responsible for a number of projects relating to data and evidence, including the Royal Statistical Society's COVID-19 task force, the Alliance for Useful Evidence, the Innovation Growth Lab, and the Innovation Index. And he currently sits on the Productivity Commission of the Productivity Institute, which of course is centered here in Alliance Manchester Business School. Now, in today's lecture, Stian will discuss one of the UK's oldest and toughest social and political problems, the gap between the rich and economically overheated Southeast and the country as a whole. He will explore how regional inequality is being exacerbated by the wider shift from physical capital to intangibles such as ideas, brands, and skills. He will also discuss the political economy of fixing the issue, which involves solving one of the 2 very large problems, either significantly increasing the productivity of poorer towns and cities in the UK, and or, as I corrected in my speech, but maybe because I wanted it as an and or, intensifying development in rich places that have historically been reluctant to grow. The lecture will be facilitated by Richard Jones, who's a professor of materials physics and innovation policy at the University of Manchester, and also our Vice President for Regional Innovation and Civic Engagement, and indeed also a co-investigator in the Productivity Institute here in the Business School. There will, as ever, be plenty of time towards the end of today's sessions for your questions. Those in the room can raise their hands in the conventional way, while those online can type them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we will include those questions, of course, in the discussion at the end of the session. So without further ado, now let me hand over to Stian. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that extremely kind and generous welcome. And thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to be here in the University of Manchester, a place that is a beacon in many ways for economic development, and I think also to be among so many people who've made such an intellectual contribution to so many of these important questions about economic development and place. What I'd like to talk about today is really the intersection of this question of economic growth and place and some of the research that I've worked on, particularly with my co-author, Jonathan Haskell, on intangible capital. Some of these ideas about intangible capital may be familiar to those who know about intangibles. Some of the ideas about place may be familiar to the people who know about the economics of place. Hopefully there'll be something in the intersection which will prompt and spark debate. I'm going to go through this in 3 phases. First of all, just briefly talking about some of the, I think, widely agreed on facts about the economy and place in the UK. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the shift to intangible capital in the economy. Those of you who know my work may be familiar with this, but it's quite helpful to go through. And then just to try and explore, well, how might some of those things cross-fertilize and influence one another? And then, as you heard, we'll have lots of time for questions and discussions. Versions of this chart will be familiar to you. I like this one because it's the classic put together by my friend Tom Forth at Open Innovations in Leeds. But this is sort of a summary of one of the brutest facts of regional inequality in the UK. We have on the top right corner one very large UK city that is very productive in terms of gross value added per worker. We all know that's London. In most rich countries, we would expect to see a upward sloping line, a relationship, an agglomeration relationship between productivity and population. In the UK, we don't see that. And that gives rise to the 2 problems that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. On the one hand, our core cities are major cities outside London, which are relatively lower productivity, less rich than we might otherwise expect. And then a bunch of places in the southeast, one of them very big, lots of them much smaller, that are, as we might say, overheated. It's very hard to build. Rentals are expensive, house prices are expensive. In all of this, I'm very much guided by the work, as I said, first of all, of Tom Forth. There's a header from Tom Forth's blog, things like Tom's very influential report that he wrote with Richard for Nesta. And usefully, as I was preparing this lecture, Anna Stansbury from MIT and Ed Balls put together this fascinating report, which was a very nice economist take on many of the issues that Tom has been writing about for the last 7 years. So just as I was trying to pull together various bits of economic research confirming some of the things that Tom said, I happily found it was done for me. So we'll return to some of those themes later. But now I wanted to talk a little bit about the shift to intangibles and why that might play a role in some of these things. And I'd like to start from talking about this kind of vivid example of how business has changed. Some of you will recognize that building on the left. It's the Ford factory in Dagenham, built in 1931. Even now, after a significant reduction in workforce, it employs 2,000 people. For the last 20 years, hundreds of millions of pounds of capital, fixed capital, have been invested in the building. It's a kind of icon of the way production facilities traditionally used to work. I don't know if anyone recognizes what is special about the building on the right. This is the headquarters building of OpenAI and Neuralink in San Francisco. So a kind of a site, a very important site of contemporary production. It is a kind of a nice historic old building. They used to manufacture trunks, steamer trunks there in 1900. About $5 million has been spent on refurbishing that building. Physical capital is not what's going on there. It's a different site of production. And really what this underpins is the change in the economy from what we might think of as tangible capital, tangible investment, to intangible capital, things that we can't see and touch, but which nevertheless deliver a benefit to businesses and to the economy over time. Tangible investments, things like buildings, more recently computers, but traditionally plant and machinery for vehicles. From an economic point of view, we define an investment as something that is made by a producer that incurs some upfront cost, either in cash or in having to build it, and it delivers a benefit over time. Now, if these things on the left are investments, the rationale for looking at intangible capital is that all these things on the right share those characteristics in the center. Classically, when we think about innovation science policy, we think about things like R&D, or potentially at the bottom, software and data. But one of the things I'm at pains to say when we talk about the intangible capital is it's not just the knowledge economy, because some of these assets in the middle, like brands, like durable relationships with one's supply chains and with partners, organizational characteristics, they're not really knowledge assets. They're kind of emotional, they're relational, they're social assets. But the point that unifies all of these things is you can't, if you hit them with your foot, you don't stub your toe, unlike the things on the left. And what we talk about, and what particularly my co-author Jonathan's research over the years has looked at, is trying to measure the change from one to the other. Again, if we look at large public companies over time, the list on the left, as of the end of March, almost all those companies are very intangible intensive. The Berkshire Hathaway possibly the exclusion, because it's basically a conglomerate of a mixture of businesses. But if we look about 40 years ago, most of those companies were much more tangible intensive. They still had intangible assets, but if you look at companies that own lots of oil wells, that own large car factories, things are quite different. The other thing that I think is important to stress about all of this is this is not just a story about tech, even though a lot of those companies in the market cap chart were tech companies. And the way I like to talk about this is to think about an industry that is really, really physical. The gym industry. I mean, it's literally a place where you have heavy weights to pick up and where you focus on physiques, literally physical things. And this is a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger's breakout movie, Pumping Iron, released in 1977, which was kind of the breakout movie of gym culture. And here's Arnold Schwarzenegger, his back's to us on the right, with some kind of burly gym guys, and they're in a branch of Gold's Gym, which is now a chain, but back then was a kind of Southern California one-off, a big cultural icon. And if you look at what was going on in this business, in Gold's Gym business, the capital there is basically tangible capital. They had some weight benches, they had a building, the brand was not really a big deal then, there was only one Gold's Gym. This is a tangible capital business. But if we look at a gym nowadays, this is a gym in Florida, there's still physical capital, there are still these weight machines, there's still obviously a building, you've got to go somewhere to lift your weights. But there's also a lot more intangible capital in that business now. There's software to run the gym systems. These are places that now employ workers in all sorts of standard protocols, so there's training processes. There's a huge investment in branding and marketing. Those of you who know about the gym business will know that the way you make money in the gym business is by persuading people to join your gym and then not turn up. And all of that takes quite a lot of investment in branding and marketing. But to me, even more interestingly, if you go into most of these chain gyms at the moment, there is a hidden business, there's a different business going on in the gym. Companies like Les Mills, who run high-intensity interval training or other fitness classes, will be a separate business from the gym, but they are basically pure intangibles players. They license music, they write workout routines, and they sell them under license to the gyms. And people, part of the reason they join these gyms is because they offer body pump classes. They're very popular. So, you know, this is a cute story, but we see this in industry after industry, that even businesses that are very physical, shipping, manufacturing, are becoming interpenetrated, innovated almost with these intangible assets. So Facebook, Google, they're intangible intensive businesses, but this is not fundamentally a story about those businesses. This is a story about all businesses. Again, refer back to the work of Jonathan and Carol Corrado and other economists on this. One of the things that they show, they carefully try to measure these kind of things, and they show the red line is tangible capital over time, the blue line is intangible capital over time as a share of GDP. This is the US and selected EU countries. On the right-hand side is a longer time scale that Carol put together that tries to measure it just in the US. But the kind of story here is this is our long-term secular trend. And what's really interesting is, again, going back to this question of, is this tech? As far as we can see, this predates not just the internet, but also predates the invention of the semiconductor. This is something that's been going on for a really long time. And many of you will know the kind of interesting kind of control revolution literature that says, well, maybe there's a sense in which computers almost came into being or as business machines because intangibles are so important rather than the other way around. Speculative, but I think the story here is this is a bigger long-term trend. The reason why all this matters is that intangible capital behaves differently. And this is going to be relevant when we come back to talking about cities and place. And the way I talk about this is to say that there are 4 characteristics of intangible capital that are sort of somewhat different from tangible capital. We call these the 4 S's. The first is that they're scalable. if you have an intangible asset, like a piece of software that runs your business. To a great extent, that is scalable across a very large business without a huge amount of extra investment. If you compare that to, say, factory machinery, where if you want to up production beyond a particular point, you need to build a bigger factory, you need to buy more machines. The second characteristic, which is going to be, again, relevant to place in a second, is sunkenness. And this is particularly relates to financing. If you have a business that owns lots of tangible capital and your business goes bust, that tangible capital is often quite valuable to other people, even quite specialized machinery. It's very interesting to Google this. If you own a huge tunneling machine, there are secondary markets for this stuff that you can look up online. So if you're a creditor, for example, tangible assets are kind of good. You can sell them and make some money if your debtor goes bust. Intangible capital, much less the case. And the sort of tragic example of this, those of you who remember the telecoms industry in the 1990s might remember when Nokia went bankrupt. Nokia owned a bunch of software assets. They had an operating system called Symbian that you may remember. And those software assets were actually bought by Microsoft, which you might think suggests, well, they weren't that sunken. Microsoft a year later wrote them off to the tune of about $5 billion, which was a sign that Microsoft accountants have not yet caught up with the sunkenness of intangible assets. But this is a kind of a problem we see. The third characteristic, a kind of many, many decades old economic observation, is that intangible capital tends to have spillovers. If you invest, particularly in things like R&D, but not just R&D, things like design, to some extent brands, other people, other firms can get some or even all of the benefits of those investments. If you think back, another mobile phone example, I don't know if anyone had a smartphone before the iPhone, but I vaguely remember they all looked really weird. They were all kind of, people were experimenting with all sorts of different designs. They were often a bit rubbish. They didn't catch on. As soon as Apple designed the iPhone, within about 18 months, every phone looked like an iPhone. This was a dominant design, and Apple received no money beyond the profits they made themselves. Everyone else got the benefit of this. So spillovers are important from that point of view. And then finally, intangible assets tend to show unusually large synergies. Obviously, combining capital is always something that can create value. But we find in particular that when you bring together the right combinations of intangible assets, they can be really, really valuable. And again, I know we have a lot of people from the innovation studies community in the audience, but I think here is, say, Brian Arthur's model of combinatorial innovation, where he shows that most innovations are combinations of other innovations, and that the increase in value tends to jump very quickly if you combine things in the right way. I'm going to skip through these specifics because these are really just a bit more detail on those things, but obviously if people want more specifics, we can come back to it. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about an intangible economy is we would argue that institutions become particularly important as the tangible economy changes to an intangible economy. And I suspect for some of you in the audience, the idea that institutions are contingent on technologies will not be controversial. Some economists I talk to find this incredibly controversial, so I'm going to make my argument for it anyway. If this is clear to you, then apologies. But I like to tell the story in terms of lighthouses. So this is, my family is from Plymouth originally. This is the Plymouth Eddystone Lighthouse, kind of an early lighthouse that was off the coast of England. In 1861, there was a kind of moral and economic panic in England because our lighthouses were not good enough. There was a royal commission on it, and it turned out that France had more lighthouses than England. This was a national disgrace. This was absolutely terrible. And what was even worse, they'd invented this wonderful type of lens called a Fresnel lens. So they're very beautiful. I'll show you a picture of one in a second. These Fresnel lenses were really, really good lenses. They were very bright. They used sort of prisms to shine light a very long way away. And the French and the Americans had these Fresnel lenses, and the English didn't. You know, Britannia was meant to rule the waves. What was going on with our lighthouses? So the commission looked into all of this and tried to work out. Here's a Fresnel lens. They're really beautiful things. And fundamentally, this was a question of institutional design. British lighthouses were privately provided, and the way you paid for them was when you docked at the harbour that the lighthouse was near, you paid a fee, and some of that fee went to pay the lighthouse keeper and pay for the upkeep of the lighthouse. And that was fine before they invented these lenses, because lighthouses didn't shine their light very far because the lenses were bad. And therefore, the only people who used the lighthouse would be people who were docking at that port. Now, when the French invented this kind of fantastic lens, it turned out that lighthouses were much more useful to a much greater range of people. And the people who were benefiting from the lighthouse wouldn't necessarily dock at the local port, and so you couldn't collect dues from them. So the British model turned out to be a really bad institutional design for this new age of technology. Britain did a lot of experimentation, but we didn't roll out these lenses more broadly. And in France, where lighthouses were basically just centrally funded, they were publicly provided, their institutions were better equipped for the new technology. I'm sure many of you will be able to provide lots more examples like this, but this is my attempt to give an example of why changes in technology require new institutions, and institutions are technologically contingent. The tech people at the moment like to call this tech governance fit, but as is often the case, this is not something that tech people invented, even though they sort of think this is a new term. There's a couple of principles that I wanted to actually highlight in a second, which I think follow on from this. There are a couple of principles that follow on if institutions matter that we talk about in our various books, which will again become really relevant when we look at the effect on cities. The first is the importance when you're changing institutions of finding ways of compensating the people who lose out. Eleanor Ostrom's work looking at how people governed commons, how fishermen regulated scarce but shared resources, I think was really interesting on this. And I think the moral of this is if you want institutions that can deal with technical change, you either need to find ways of depriving losers of their voice, which is very hard to do and perhaps not just, or you need to find ways of compensating them with some of the benefits. So we'll come to this later. The other theme that will become relevant, which we explored in Intangibles, is the dichotomy between these two, in some ways, iconic types of innovation. And they both speak to a different aspect of intangible capital, which again will become relevant. If you think about these two kind of second half of the 20th century innovations, the Saturn V, the Apollo space program, and the wheelie suitcase, the rollerboard suitcase. These both get talked about a lot, but they have very different characteristics. And which of them you think is typical or ideal typical is going to affect your view about what makes innovation flourish. The Apollo program was kind of a quantity play. You needed to invest a hell of a lot of money in R&D to put a person on the moon. And the problem here, the problem that public policy had to solve, the problem that institutions had to solve, was this problem of spillovers. If you just expected the private sector to put a man on the moon, fairly obviously it wouldn't have happened. It required the US government to put lots and lots of money into it to fund these kind of risky developments and then to ultimately pay for the project. In some ways, the kind of project that they were doing was very clear. There wasn't a lot of uncertainty about the goal. Everyone knows where the moon is. Everyone knows that you need a very big rocket to get there. But some innovation challenges are like this. You just have to throw resources at them. And what matters is the quantity of investment. The wheelie suitcase is obviously a different type of investment. The wheelie suitcase is a classic synergy story between the suitcase and the wheel. You just have to combine two things. And the difficult thing was realizing that these are valuable. And it's probably no accident that it was put together by pilots and flight attendants who had a lot of particular experience in this new emerging need of jet travel. And this relies on the idea that capital, and particularly intangible capital, is heterogeneous. This is kind of a throwback to the Cambridge capital controversy in the early to mid 20th century. But I guess what's important about this is if synergies really matter, and if getting the right synergies really matter, then it's not the quantity investment that matters. There was not a big R&D budget behind the wheelie suitcase, but the quality investment and the institutions behind that, whether that's effective market mechanisms or effective investment mechanisms to make really good investments that really matters. And are intangible assets quantity plays or quality plays? They're kind of both, but which they are at a given time will help you determine what sort of institutions you need. So now I'm going to talk about some of the change in science policy. And before we launch into regional play, I do think it's interesting that this heterogeneity point does seem to be informing a lot of the developments that we're seeing in science policy, both in the UK and in the rest of Europe and in the US. People, especially who work in higher educational research, will be aware of the big movement towards trying to find new ways and new modalities of funding. ARIA is obviously the UK's new innovation agency. There are lots of ARIA-like institutions in other countries. they're all predicated on the idea that the particular model, the kind of expert program manager-led model with a kind of blue skies remit, is going to help you find the equivalent of wheelie suitcases in blue sky science. So it's sort of a play of saying that, goodness me, if we can only get the selection mechanism right, we will hit home runs. I think it's an interesting case. It remains to be seen whether it's effective, but that seems to be the underlying logic behind why you would set something up like ARIA or like a focused research organization. It also lies behind, I think, some of the kind of massive interest in innovation policy. They don't call it that, they call it progress studies, but the interest in innovation policy that you see from a lot of very rich tech people in the US. These are people who've run intangible intensive businesses, and they're sort of thinking, well, surely there are ways we can do more of this. Again, a question about whether all of this will work, but I think that's sort of the underlying theory. Again, there's also this question of, if quality really matters, then it might really make sense to try very hard to avoid dysfunctional practices. So my friend Stuart Ritchie's book, Science Fictions, is one of many books that looks at dysfunctional incentives in research culture. Again, there are fields, and we can look at what happens in sort of aspects of social psychology, where you could argue that there have been problems that have led to a lot of malinvestment, as it were, in research and development. Initiatives like DORA, the international research metrics, responsible research metrics incentives, is a sort of the carrot version of the stick of those kind of things. But again, this is all predicated on the idea that because there's a big difference between really valuable intangibles and really non-valuable ones, that it really matters to kind of fix your institutions. But I promised I would come to place. I guess the first conclusion is, or the first implication of an intangible economy, is that in a world where these spillovers and these synergies become really, really important, place becomes really important as well. One of the lessons from the pandemic, and I say this as someone who was writing about this in the early days of the pandemic and was really worried that our entire book would be obsolete, but one of the things that unfortunately, we concluded from the pandemic was that face-to-face communication still really matters. And it particularly matters to high trust communications around sharing ideas. It matters around labor markets still, despite some remote working, if you want to share ideas by hiring other people's employees. And it matters about kind of the century-old literature on clusters and ideas being in the air. In an economy where there's more intangibles, spillovers and synergies are more important to businesses and to the economy as a whole. And so thriving places will thrive more, and places that aren't thriving will do even worse. And to me, this is a big part of the phenomenon that people like Enrico Moretti have been talking about for over a decade, about how there's a greater divergence between the most prosperous and the least prosperous places in the developed world. This in some ways is a clear conclusion, but it does create, as you heard in the introduction, a kind of dilemma for policymakers, or a real challenge about which problem that you try and solve. Because as we've seen, the UK has a problem of some cities that we feel ought to be more prosperous than they are, that are kind of on that downward slope potentially of Moretti's dichotomy. And we have an extremely highly productive, but extremely overheated part of the country, surrounded by tight green belts, where I think I saw a figure yesterday, we now have a record rent in all London boroughs for domestic properties, but a kind of crazy situation, which is not particularly conducive to expanding those areas. So from a policymaker's point of view, you have to solve ideally two, but definitely more than zero of these problems. How do you either make core cities more productive, or how do you increase density in places that are productive already? This then leads us to look through what some policy ideas might be to improve core city productivity. And for some of you, these will be things that are dear to your hearts that you've been working on. I guess I should start by saying, as I said, I've been very guided by the Anna Stansbury and Ed Ball's paper. I thought it was a really useful summary of what I find the compelling economic literature on UK regions. I think it's very interesting. I should give credit to Tom Forth and others, because a lot of these ideas were things that they fleshed out before, but it's good to see it developed in in the MIT paper. But Stansbury highlighted, I think, three really big core city challenges. First of all, this idea that our core cities, for the most part, act like smaller than cities than they are because of underinvestment in transport. We have a lot of congestion. Again, Tom Forth, I think, first showed this using some data on bus travel in Birmingham, but Stansbury and Balls showed it in more cities. Those agglomeration effects that we would expect to see perhaps don't obtain because it's very hard to get around, so travel to work areas aren't as big. The second issue, which Tom and Richard and many people here have commented on a lot in the past, is the fact that in the UK, we have a very interesting institutional setup for how we allocate public R&D funds. There's definitely been some improvements in this area, but for the most part, this is still, and I'll present some data on this later, most of our investment goes to these more overheated cities in the Golden Triangle, and places like the Northwest, the West Midlands are relatively deprived of R&D funding, and in particular, they don't invest, there's not as much public investment as you would expect given the amount of private R&D investment. And then the interesting thing that Stansbury found is that there wasn't really a shortage in core cities of graduate level skills, and they did some really interesting work looking at wage differentials to suggest that that wasn't the initial problem, although they did find shortages of STEM graduate skills, and there's an open question as to whether there's a problem of technical education, which we will discuss a little bit more in a second. And again, as I say, all of these things you could argue have pretty deep-rooted institutional causes in the UK. Diane Coyle and Marianne Sensier did a really interesting Bennett Institute paper a while ago, looking at how some of the benefit cost ratios used to allocate transport investment in the UK were to some extent biased in favor of London and against core cities. The really sort of flagrant example, the really terrible story is the bus deregulation story. Again, a kind of a Tom Forth classic. The story here, as you all know, is that buses were compulsorily deregulated by central government everywhere other than London. London has an out. London can unify its bus systems, which makes TfL's ticketing processes much easier and makes it easier to get around and easier for passengers to travel. So sort of an out for neoliberalism for London only, which has been beneficial to one city. One can spend a lot of time talking about the institutional causes of R&D imbalance in the UK, but clearly this is a very different situation from what we see in places like Germany and France in terms of the allocation of public R&D resources. The definition of excellence that traditionally we've used to allocate research council funding, combined with the path dependency of the fact that for several centuries it was illegal to run a university in any part of England apart from two cities, clearly plays a role. There's a question of whether the unusual centrality of higher education to the UK's publicly funded R&D system makes this harder, certainly in countries where there are big public labs in different areas. That leads potentially to some regional diversity. Certainly we see that in the US. And again, we have the question, this is not quite R&D, but it's R&D like it's intangibles. For the most part, we put our knowledge intensive public institutions either in London, or when we don't put them in London, we put them in very strange places that can't benefit from agglomeration economies. So classic example, the ONS, great place. Many of its employees are members of mine at the moment. But the fact that it was moved to Newport rather than moved to Bristol or Cardiff or a larger city that could benefit from more agglomerations is certainly a question that's been much debated in the last 20 years since it happened. And then finally on graduate skills, certainly Stansbury's conclusion certainly was that the skills problem is mostly a demand phenomenon. It's just increasing the supply, particularly of graduate skills, won't necessarily be a strong move for regional development. But I think there's an interesting question that we can talk about whether stronger institutions might make it easier to identify skills needs, particularly when it comes to technical skills. I said I would come back to sunkenness, this idea that intangibles often represents a sunk cost. And I think here's an interesting question that we see when it comes to finance, and it works through a slightly strange mechanism. So as we've said, intangible assets are not much use as collateral for bank loans. Schoenholz and Cicchetti wrote a really interesting paper where they call this the curse of collateral. Once upon a time, if you had tangible assets, banks really like lending against that. That's much harder for intangible intensive businesses. If you're a really, really fast growing intangible intensive business that expects to make a vast amount of enterprise value, you have an out from this. You can raise venture capital or growth capital, but that's relevant to a tiny fraction of businesses, even though, we love venture capitalists and think they're great. It's not relevant for most businesses. Most businesses are still reliant on one form or another of bank debt. And what it turns out is that the way intangible intensive businesses often end up getting bank debt is what you might call hidden mortgage lending. So Dan Davies talked about this. He was a bank equity analyst, and then my co-author Jonathan Haskell did a bit more research on this at the bank. And what we find is that intangible intensive businesses their investment is sensitive to the value of the directors' houses, because banks are often taking a charge on the houses of the directors to effectively create collateral. The regional dimension of this will probably be obvious to you, which is there is one part of the country where company directors are disproportionately likely to own a very expensive house, and that's the southeast. And you would expect to see that this is going to create a hidden bias for access to finance, and that bias, to the extent that it exists, will get larger the more reliant you are on intangible capital. I didn't want to avoid talking about health inequalities, because I know it's something that is a lot of people in the university work on, and it's clearly an issue in many core cities. This is the Health Foundation's map of life expectancy at birth, and the regional imbalance is clearly very stark. This is also something where we've seen a significant post-COVID effect that people are still trying to flesh out the explanation for. We've seen more people leave the workforce, possibly due to ill health, possibly due to NHS waiting lists, particularly towards the upper end of the age distribution since the pandemic. And I think there's an interesting, at least question, it would be interesting to see more research on this, about whether this is actually destroying intangible capital in firms. Obviously, health inequalities are unacceptable from a moral point of view, but if you have a heart of stone and don't worry about that, then consider the economic downside as well. It's certainly something I've heard a lot anecdotally, that in businesses, when older employees retire, particularly if those businesses are underinvested in systems and processes, they take with them a lot of organizational capital. That organizational capital will never be on the balance sheet, but it will have the similar equivalent to scrapping intangible capital. I think there's some evidence that this might be the case. There's a great bit of US analysis by those guys, including from the US Census Bureau, that basically suggested that there was more firm capital tied up in labor in smaller firms. So if we are looking at a situation where health inequalities or poor health is forcing older workers out of the economy, that might be particularly painful in an economy that's reliant on intangible capital. Speculative, but it's a side of the health inequalities debate with an intangible dimension. I said I'd come back to skills, and again, I think this might be an interesting institutional question raised here. So as I said, the Stansbury paper that tried to look at the price charged for different types of skills in the economy found it quite hard to find any evidence on higher technical skills. And there were various reasons they gave from that, basically partly because the data on higher technical skills are very bad. It's quite hard to differentiate different things. But Paul Lewis at King's work, funded by the Gatsby Foundation, made this very interesting point that technical skills are extremely heterogeneous. So he looked at the personalized medicine sector effectively and said that, well, it actually really, really matters whether you're getting exactly the right skills. And if you don't match the worker and the skills extremely well, you're not creating a lot of value. So it's kind of the opposite of a world in which just as long as you get a degree, you can hire that person. Now, if that's the case, and if this is the case more broadly beyond that sector, which at least seems plausible in the context of the heterogeneity of intangible capital, then stronger local economic development institutions might be really helpful in terms of making that matching process work. You all know these questions better than I do, but clearly the part of that is about devolution, part of that is about effective funding, part of it is probably about nodal institutions. I talked about catapult centres or places like Open Innovations in Leeds, which bring together employers. In our discussion earlier, Andy Westwood made the point that actually further education colleges themselves may very much play this role when they're working effectively. So there's an interesting question about maybe you need more local institutions to ensure the right matching between intangible capital, and that matters more in an economy where there is more intangible capital around. I said the other side of this coin, the other problem that you might want to fix is you might want to try and densify the more productive cities that we already had. And I think we need to start any examination of this question by acknowledging that attempts to do this in the past have, for the most part, been an absolutely dismal failure. The 1948 Town and Country Planning Act that established the Greenbelt, established our planning processes, is wildly popular. You know, it and the NHS are the two most popular things that came out of the 1940s, and they're probably the two most popular British institutions. So if you fight the Greenbelt, if you fight the Town and Country Planning Act, if you fight the NIMBYs, you will lose. It's something I tell to everyone in politics. You will not win. And part of the reason for that comes back to this kind of Ostromian observation that the losers from planning are concentrated. The winners, the people who benefit from the fact that if you build lots and lots and lots of houses, prices might fall a bit, or that you might want to move into a neighborhood, they're distributed. They don't care as much as the losers. So it's a really difficult thing to build, to politically mobilize. And if you look at protests against development, there's an extremely strong sense of moral justice on the side of anti-development protesters. This is a very hard thing to push back against. Now, there is a problem that affects the wider country from this as well, which is if you do have a world in which Cambridge, let's say, benefits from lots of public investment, is extremely prosperous, but it's very hard to move there. The only people who can afford to move there are the most highly skilled, the most highly paid people who go and get some very, fantastic job at AstraZeneca or at a Cambridge venture fund or something like that. So to the extent that there are any broader benefits to this kind of local economic growth, it gets even more concentrated. Those of you who are familiar with David Goodhart's kind of viral idea about somewheres and anywheres, he has this sort of idea that there's something almost inherent to people that some people don't like, they just like to stay where they are, and other people are kind of rootless cosmopolitans. I do often wonder whether this is not actually something that's in our hearts, but something that's highly influenceable by economic realities, and that in a world where you can afford to move to where jobs are, that actually a lot more people would be interested and willing to do that than David might have us believe. But anyway, this is a really difficult problem to solve. I think there are some interesting policy solutions, and they rely on finding ways of sharing some of the potential benefits from densification. Tim Loynig, who's a kind of economic historian and sort of very bright serial government advisor, has spent a long time looking at things like community land auctions to try and share the planning gain, because obviously if you do rezone land for planning, it will massively rise in value. And one of the big problems of our current system is that land value increase is mostly captured by developers. One of Tim's very interesting long-standing proposals has been the idea of building a Cambridge Newtown on the lines of Edinburgh Newtown, a kind of massive extension to Cambridge, which would hopefully lower housing prices, and is based on the idea of sharing planning gain and investing in a lot of beautiful and therefore hopefully more popular development by basically expropriating some of that gain. Kind of an interesting idea. Always hard to know if these things will work. The other proposal that has gained some traction recently is the idea of pushing the decisions to densify down to a lower level. So at the moment, things are voted on. Well, things are matters of local democracy, so they'll be voted on by a group, or there will be the purview of a group of about 100,000 or more people. Something that has worked to some extent in Israel and South Korea is to allow individual streets or individual blocks to vote on densification. Obviously, if you are in a street and you own property, the benefits of densification are massive. The financial benefits to you of densification are massive, because building more stories in an area, for example, like that, some bungalows near a tube station in London, if you were to densify, they pay for the development cost and they pay for a life-changing windfall for all the occupiers. I think the proponents of street votes would say, well, most streets will not vote for densification, but you don't need that many streets to vote for this to significantly increase the housing supply in somewhere like London or another overheated southeastern town. So I don't know if these two methods will work, but I think what we can take away, or what I conclude from this is, if you want the best chance we have of something working in this field is if you can share the gain to overcome the political problem. So in some ways, it's a political science problem rather than an economics problem. To sort of conclude, we come back to these kind of two challenges. And I think it's worth acknowledging that I talk about these things in rooms, and I will go to rooms where people think the answer is to densify the southeast, and they will say that the idea of increasing productivity in core cities is ridiculous and implausible. And equally, I go in other rooms and people say, well, the idea of densifying the southeast is impossible and is never going to happen. And there is kind of an optimistic and pessimistic case for both of these. If we think about making core cities productive, this has been a very, very long-standing part of British public policy. I've got a very treasured at home copy of the 1965 National Plan, Harold Wilson and George Brown's National Plan. And it has a long chapter on how to make the North more prosperous. And there is one thing that it achieved, because it says that we must end the economic dominance of London and the Midlands. And the one thing they did manage to achieve was they managed to stuff the Midlands. But the obvious problem that Britain has been trying to solve in this area for at least a century has not been solved. So that is what the glass half empty people will tell me when I try and pitch this agenda. But again, I will finish on this subject with a Tom Forthism, as Tom would say, we never even tried. And what he means by that is, if you look at, what we talked about earlier, the dispersion of R&D investment, the dispersion of transport investment around the country, we haven't really tried. And I encounter policy elites in Westminster who will tell me entirely seriously that Manchester is leveled up already because they've gone to the centre of Manchester and seen some shiny buildings. It's remarkable, and they will then sort of say, well, now we need to move on to sorting out towns. But in some ways, that shows the sort of the inherent truth in the sort of Tom Forth argument that people have given up or think that they've declared victory long before anyone's even really made an attempt to solve the problem. So I'm optimistic about this, and I hope that, I know many of you in this audience, it's your life work, so you will share that optimism. Again, when it comes to the overheated southeast, as I said earlier, most people tell you NIMBYs always win. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings, with an 80-seat majority, dropped all their planning reform plans. The Liberal Democrats, who used to be neutral on this, have now become sort of quite. There's a lot of NIMBYism in their current policy platform. This is a difficult battle to win for the reasons that we've had, that the losers are concentrated and powerful, and the winners are dispersed and vague and don't care that much. But again, we come back to this economic reality that because the prize at stake is so large, there at least ought to be the possibility, if you can come up with the right incentive structure, again, if you can solve a political science problem, there ought to be a lot of potential energy behind this to solve the problem, if you can design the incentives right. So again, a cause for some optimism. Designing institutions is not easy, but at least there's some potential energy, some potential economic energy behind it. Again, if we solve one of these two problems, that would be fantastic. If we can solve both of these problems, I would be very optimistic about UK productivity growth. And it feels like this is worth having a go, probably at both. I'm going to leave it there. I think that's I hope I've conveyed that many of these questions have an intangible flavor. Hopefully tied some of those things into issues that I know many of you have been working on and studying for years. All of this work is reliant on the work that I've done with Jonathan Haskell, so although he's not here, I'd like to thank him for his contribution to all of this. And I'd be very keen to get questions, comments, responses. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stian. That's a really clear and lucid exposition of the problems. I kind of like the optimism at the end. The two books are great. I can recommend them very thoroughly to anyone who's not read them. So settle down for a moment. We'll see if there are any questions. I'm going to, I guess, have the privilege of asking the first one, which is maybe a mild challenge. So in the contrast between Ford, Dagenham and OpenAI is fantastic and telling. But of course, a counter view would be to say, okay, OpenAI only works because there's a factory in Taiwan that costs $20 billion that makes the chips, and there are cloud suppliers that do that. So to what extent is the move to intangibles a global move to intangibles? To what extent is it a division of labor between people who are doing the intangible stuff and people who are still making things and wiring them up and making big server farms?
So I think it's a very good question. It's a very fair challenge. I think the person I always think about when I think about this issue is Václav Smil, who I know we're both admirers of. And he will talk about the kind of stubborn persistence of the physical world. It's certainly true that the intangible economy doesn't mean that we can do without the physical world, and it doesn't mean that the physical world won't frequently rudely impinge on our prosperity and our happiness. And we've seen COVID, we've seen kinetic warfare in Ukraine. All of these things in recent years have kind of intruded on the world of intangibles. But what I would say is that nevertheless, I think the story of the gradual move to intangibles, the fact that intangibles are becoming more preponderant is still correct. And I think sort of three examples that really bring that to life for me. The first, coming back to what you're saying about the factories in Taiwan, I think TSMC is a really interesting example here of a story, because obviously there are physical assets, there are clean rooms, there are extremely high spec fabs where semiconductors get made. But in a sense, the Taiwanese semiconductor factory is also an extremely valuable assemblage of intangible assets. There's a huge amount of technical skill among the workforce there that's extremely job specific. There are extremely valuable supply chains, which things depend on, not just the supply chains of selling chips and of designing chips, but also of bringing together the CDA software, the machines, and all those kind of things. And clearly, this is an entirely R&D dependent industry. So I think there's a sense in which if you had to value TSMC, even that company, which owns a lot of valuable tangible assets, is going to have a really big intangible item on your balance sheet if you kind of worked it all out. The other story that, I don't know, to me illustrates a bit of this is if we think about the experience of COVID, and again, thinking back to the early days of the pandemic. And certainly I recall there being a very big reaction that was sort of a tangible capital heavy response. So there was a big panic both in the UK and the US about, would we have enough ventilators? Would we be able to build what we ended up calling Nightingale hospitals? And I think people looked at China and said, wow, China have built these new hospitals. We haven't built these hospitals. The decadent West will lose. And this was, again, a tangible capital story. But then if we look at what actually happened, how, to the extent we dealt with COVID, that we dealt with it, it was R&D, new vaccine development. It was the really complex business of coming up with non-pharmaceutical interventions and persuading people how to use them, a kind of social and expressive phenomenon as much as anything else. And if we look at testing and tracing, to the extent that that was an effective part of the response, again, it's a software, it's a data, it's a processes question. And so again, these things where even where we thought that the physical world had kind of reasserted its dominance, it had to some extent, but actually intangibles still played a really important role.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fascinating. And, I think as you say, TSMC is a fantastic and interesting company. And the idea that, the 20 billion or whatever at the capital, in a sense, that's an embodiment of huge amounts of R&D that went into that extreme UV machine or whatever it was, which all makes me suspect that I'm not sure that the right side won in the Cambridge Capital controversy, but I don't know. More smarter people than me will be able to comment on that. But let's have some questions from the audience. So over there, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Paddy Moe, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of broadly ask about the Levelling Up White Paper's 6 Capitals framework and just sort of broadly gauge your impression on how well that understands those ideas that you're talking about with intangible capital and sort of moves that forward into the real world.
So that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's a very helpful framework, I think, in terms of helping people to think about the lasting value about things that take effort one way or another to create and deliver benefits in the long term. Obviously, a kind of tangible intangible capital framework has got 2 capitals, and as you said, there are 6 or maybe now 7 in the levelling up framework. So it is justified to sort of say, well, what about the other 4 to 5 forms of capital? To some extent, that's kind of a techie accounting issue, that what we've looked at things that, because we're looking at this from a system of national accounts perspective, we're looking at things that are an asset of a firm or of the producer. So I would absolutely not deny that, for example, social capital is a thing, but social capital is not, for the most part, an asset of a producer. So although I recognize it and think that it's important, it's a sort of separate topic from the one that we've looked at. I think, you could talk about social capital without using the word capital if you wanted to be a purist about it. One could talk about it in using a different kind of metaphor, because to some extent that's arbitrary. But I can see why it is quite useful to do that if you want to. I guess the other thing is when it comes to natural capital as well, this is something that clearly is incredibly important from the point of view of humanity. Again, it's not for the most part an asset of the firm. So I think it depends what your frame of reference is, but hopefully that explains the 2 versus 6 to 7 angle.
Right, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Graham Winch from MBS. I've actually got 2 questions, different questions. Firstly, what's the role of professional and business services in this intangible story? Because that is the 200-year-old almost intangible business sector, isn't it? And so that must play an enormous role in this. And also, of course, it's one area where the UK economy has been relatively high performing in global markets. My second question is rather different. What's the role of interurban transport in all this? Because clearly it's unfashionable to say that HS2 is about speed, but clearly being able to get from Manchester to London in an hour is actually reliably is transformative compared to present speeds. And could that play a role in this de-densification process in the southeast?
So those are 2 really good questions. So to take the professional services question first, clearly some professional services are classically involved in the production of intangibles. So a designer, for example, produces design, and that's an intangible asset. I guess what asking about professional services quite neatly exposes is a possible flaw, conceptual flaw, in the kind of economist approach to thinking about capital as something that incurs an upfront measurable cost to create an asset. And this is always one of the challenges of this approach, because speaking as an ex-management consultant, management consultants like to think they create new frameworks and ways of doing things. They certainly create replicable methodologies of projects that then go on to sort of generate money, but they don't really do R&D. So when, for example, I don't know, I worked on hospital reconfiguration studies, there would be what we call an O1 study, the first time you do a project, but that would be paid for by a client. And the fact is that your R&D is basically learning by doing. Clearly, if you look at Jim Besson's work, there is probably a lot of learning by doing going on in the economy. And on one level, that's fine. That creates what you could call an intangible capital asset. It's very tricky for this economic model because you can never apportion a cost to it. It's something that happens sort of almost by accident. And at some point, the measurement of all this stuff potentially breaks if there's too much learning by doing going on. Something that's a challenge. In terms of interurban transport, I think my prejudice is it is very important. I think one of the things that we were wondering in the early stages of the pandemic with remote working is, could this kind of could this cause to some extent the death of distance, as has been sort of prophesied for many decades without happening? And perhaps the problem is thinking of the death of distance is too binary, but actually that maybe there are certain things that vitiate some of these agglomeration effects. Maybe working from home does that a bit, maybe effective intercity transport does that as well. So it kind of exhibits there's a sliding scale.
There was another question at the back, I think, first. So, yeah. So,
thanks very much. My name is Fumiki Tagawa. I'm from University of Birmingham. I'd like to ask probably the changing role of the universities here. You mentioned like a past dependency and kind of university focus on the system, and also you mentioned catapult centers, kind of skills and interface role. So I wonder, probably some different institutional expectational setup might be needed to cope with the intangible kind of demands and new expectation. Universities kind of, we've talked a lot about roles of universities saying, but probably something different setup and design may be needed. I wonder if you have any comments.
It's a really good question, and it's a good question. It's a nice question to be asked here in the University of Manchester when, having heard about the huge role that the university plays, not just in the creation of knowledge and the education of individuals, but as a hub, as a mobilizer of local business efforts, and as a coordinator of investments across the economy. So I guess the age-old vision of a civic university potentially becomes more important given the importance of combining different types of intangible capitals in an economy. The other potential change or amplification of the role of universities is one thing we do talk about in our book is, because in an intangible economy, these jobs where you combine bits of knowledge, bits of intangible capital, because those jobs become more important. Some of those jobs rely a lot on social power. And one could argue that obtaining those jobs, signaling becomes more important to obtain those. So prestigious qualifications are potentially more important in a world where intangibles matter and where there are kind of highly paid roles to bring intangibles together. So there's obviously a long-standing debate about university education. To what extent is university education? To what extent does it involve genuine human capital formation? To what extent does it involve signaling, which is potentially more zero-sum? If you think that signaling is a problem, you might expect to see more signaling in an intangible intensive economy. So maybe if you were sort of saying, well, with the universities, you'd want to see more of a hub activity, that would be even more important. And you'd have to worry maybe more about the risk of some of the education functioning being diverted into signaling.
Can I just press you on that
Yes.
actually a bit? Because I think it is a really great question. And of course, we can take it for granted that the University of Manchester is an exemplary institution, but other cities may not be so lucky. And clearly the UK is an outlier in how much of its public R&D happens in universities. So what do you think the UK misses compared to, say, Germany as a country where much more R&D happens outside the university system? Anything?
So my first cautious response on that is probably more research is needed, because everything I'm about to say is going to be a little bit me reckoning based on visiting places, which is very bad. But let's speculate a bit. One could imagine that. So there is a kind of a pessimistic story about public research establishments, which says that basically various things related to government failure make them less effective. And certainly, you hear these challenges. For example, if I think about John Kingman's valedictory speech as UKRI chair, he talked about how difficult it was for some of the research council institutes, because every time they wanted to hire a senior employee, they had to go to the cabinet office and negotiate the salary. I mean, this isn't the biggest instance of government failure, but if you were a kind of a real government basher, you might say, well, there are some problems that maybe universities don't fall prey to because they have more independence. The flip side, though, an example I think of is, I used to go to Culham quite a lot, and the UKRI, because government ministers love visiting Culham. They love seeing the fusion reactor, and I know you know that institution well. Culham was very interesting because, as well as doing kind of wonderful fusion research, they hosted the Oxfordshire Manufacturing Apprentices Centre. They had a very nice science park. They were very good at showing off various spin-off technologies. So the venting technology from the fusion reactors was the basis of a scramjet or a ramjet, the reaction engines product. And again, you could imagine a story where running an organization like that that's very mission oriented, it's got a mission of producing viable fusion reactions, potentially doesn't get distracted by some of the challenging incentives that academics face, the need to publish, the need to sometimes fall within disciplinary boundaries. So you could argue that if you have the right conduct and the right incentives, public institutions might work better. You also have the benefit they're not all necessarily in Oxford and Cambridge, although the UK also has a problem of putting its public research institutions in the same places that its universities are sometimes. Yeah. So I think there's definitely a plausible story where these public institutions might be better at generating useful spillovers, might be better at bringing things together. The only reason I'm hesitant is because a lot of this is based on anecdotal experience and intuition rather than, I'd be interested to know if there is more of a literature on this.
Yeah. Well, certainly Culham's helpful in weaning the Oxfordshire economy off its failing dependence on horse racing. But moving on, there was a question over there. Bart, yeah.
Bart van Eyck, Productivity Institute. So, Stian, in your second book, which is featuring so prominently on the screen there, and which I can recommend people to read, you hint at the possibility that the growth rate of intangibles in the UK is slowing. And my question to you is, why would that be? And if that is happening, how bad is that going to be for the productivity recovery in the UK?
Yes, this is certainly something that we speculate a lot on in the book. It's a phenomenon that we kind of started to notice when we wrote the first book, and it was such a sort of relatively new phenomenon. We just thought, well, we'll brush it under the carpet and see if this situation persists. But certainly when the second book came out, by the time that came out, it looks like in the UK and in some other countries, the growth rate of intangible investment, which, as we said, had been kind of pretty persistent for a few decades, seemed to have slowed somewhat. I think, broadly speaking, we'd expect that the reasons you would expect to be institutional. I think in terms of how much cause for concern it is, I mean, I come back to a discussion that I know we were having earlier with the Productivity Institute, that there's increasing signs, as Bart was telling me, that some of the productivity challenges the UK faces are what you might call at the top end of the distribution. So for a long time, there was a sort of narrative in British public policy that the UK's best companies were really, really good. They were world beating. The problem was that we had a long tail of underperforming firms. And as Bart, as you were saying, this increasingly looks like this isn't actually quite the problem, but actually it looks like our what we thought of as our best firms might not be so well beating anymore. Now, intangibles might well be a cause of that, because if we look at the leading firms in different countries at the moment, as we see, they're intangible intensive. So a world where we're not investing so effectively in those things is probably a world where you'd see our leader firms suffering. I think that is a big challenge. If we're talking about causes, I do think, coming back to this question, I think economic geography is almost certainly a really important cause. Whether that's because the places that are generating lots of highly productive intangibles at the moment find it so hard to grow and so hard to gain employees, or whether we have sleeping giants in so many parts of the country that ought to be producing intangible intensive businesses that aren't. But again, I think we can look at all these institutional features, competition regimes, finance, terms of trade, and I think they all may play a role to some extent.
Can I just follow up that question? Is there a distinction between lagging quantities of intangible investment and lagging effectiveness or quality? And I'm thinking here, pharmaceutical industry as being an area that, clearly has been thought of as absolutely a leading sector for the UK, but, we have TPI research showing us that it's actually a pretty major cause of a major contributor to overall productivity, lagging productivity growth in the UK. And then there's this interesting literature about, R&D productivity and, exponentially falling R&D productivity in that industry. So where do you stand on that kind of quality versus quantity of intangible investment problem?
So, I think this is a fascinating question on two levels. It's in some ways the most interesting unanswered question about intangibles. I think on the one hand, you have the question of, maybe we're just getting worse at making intangible investments in particular areas. Pharma's a really interesting example. And certainly when I talk to pharma equity analysts, they will say, the large UK, AstraZeneca, GSK, have just not been as good at their development processes, at their interaction with small firms as some of the US firms. And some of that they will put down to clusters. They'll talk about how fantastic Boston is as a place to do business versus Cambridge. I don't know if that's true or not. But some of it might just be things like management skills. Maybe we're just not, maybe our large companies are just not as well run as these even better companies. But there's a kind of almost even more scary version of your question. I don't know whether this is what you had in mind, but we can all imagine most investments one would imagine that one can make are positive sum. They might be good investments and create a very large amount of value at a societal level, or they might be not so great investments and create sort of an amount of value similar to close to zero if you've really done a bad job of making that investment. But generally, you would imagine particularly tangible assets would have some kind of positive value. There are very few exceptions, and that's sort of a thought experiment. Imagine if you're a high frequency trading firm, and all that matters to you is being able to execute on your trade a nanosecond faster than your competitor. So you spend $1 million building a fiber optic cable that runs directly to the execution center of the Chicago Metals Exchange. And that is purely a zero-sum investment. You're not creating any value for society beyond the fact that you're stealing some value from the second fastest trader. Now, those investments, when it comes to tangible assets, are quite rare. But if you think about intangible assets, you can think about lots more intangible investments that are a bit like the high frequency traders cable. So if we think about an investment in organizational capital, if I am a business and I set up a Luxembourg subsidiary to allow me to avoid tax or to be structured more efficiently for tax, that will look like an intangible investment. I'll be spending money on lawyers and consultants and all that kind of thing. But the only thing that will be changing in the economy is a little bit less money will be going to the government and a bit more money will be going to my shareholders. There's not really a lot of value created there unless you have particular ideological beliefs about the tax system. And there are probably quite a lot of investments like that. And clearly a lot of the debate around tech platforms is based on the idea, a way of putting it is these guys are making a lot of intangible investments, many of which might be zero sum. So as well as the idea that maybe the UK is not very good at making these investments, you could imagine a world where the economy just gets dominated by rent seeking that looks like intangible investments but zero sum, and that will be a big problem if that's happening.
Indeed, fascinating. Kieran, we've got some questions.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions online. I'm going to start with the last in, so the most recent question. So this is from Helen Bodmer at the MRC, and she says, you mentioned that the narrow definition of excellence is an issue in R&D funding, and I believe this is widely accepted. However, there does not seem to be an agreed definition of excellence, more a shared understanding. Therefore, how would you go about broadening it?
Very good question. I think it is helpful that excellence is a social norm rather than something precisely defined. And this is something we see a lot in innovation policy, as anyone who tries to define the Haldane principle will rapidly find. I think to some extent, clearly preserving a concept of academic excellence is really important. Academic excellence is a thing. It's something that is very valuable in many contexts. So we might not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But if we think about there are clearly other concepts that are also really important, like impact, like the expected economic return to investment, that we see the system already does consider. I think the interesting question will be how to balance those considerations and which bits of R&D and other intangible funding should be measured by each of those criteria.
Now I'm going to go right to the start of the list of questions and pick a couple of questions about kind of engagement of businesses and their owners. So for instance, Andy Hume from the Northwest Business Leadership Team asked, is it fair to say that more successful places have a higher concentration of more engaged businesses, engaged, for instance, in innovation, place shaping, the skills agenda, etc.? And how would we address that for less successful places? And maybe can I put a spin on that about intangibles businesses? So do you think there's anything different or better or worse about the way intangibles oriented businesses might be engaged in place?
Yeah, I wonder whether engagement might be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. I think, we can all picture, and it makes sense in the context of intangibles, that if you have an effective cluster where businesses are working together on making investments, there's a lot of knowledge being shared, we can all imagine how that would lead to more intangible investment, more productive businesses, and general prosperity. But I guess one could also imagine a mode of engaged businesses that doesn't achieve that, the kind of complacent model that one can imagine an extremely well-coordinated economy could fall into, where actually the social connections between businesses, rather than encouraging investment, encourage a kind of complacency. I'm sort of thinking of the kind of US tire cluster story, for example, from the 20th century, how the US tire industry grew complacent. So I wonder whether you need engagement, but you need engagement combined with maybe the right kind of industry leadership.
If we can take another one, I'll take a question from Jennifer Solorzano. How do you reconcile declining aggregate employment growth with increasing intangible investment? Is there substitution?
I think there definitely is substitution. And I think in an age when there's constant speculation about AI, this is a, to the extent that is happening or will happen, it's a classic example of substitution. I think there's also a question about whether some of this substitution is useful, because, or rather, I would say that there are a lot of examples where the substitution is particularly useful, because one of the things that some types of intangible capital, particularly things like organizational development and software, are good at, is replacing potentially quite unsatisfying, mundane jobs in organizations. Clearly, the challenge then is how do we make sure that our fiscal policy, our redistribution, our monetary policy even, creates the opportunity for new employment to be created, so that this doesn't get taken out on particular people who've lost their economic niche.
Let's return to the physical world for a moment. There's a question up there, I think.
Hi, my name is Peter. I work at Manchester City Council in policy. As you might imagine, we do lots of work in this kind of space, and I guess our perception, perhaps as you might expect, is that a lot of the levers to tackle some of the problems that you described exist at a kind of national or UK government level, which has proved to be somewhat unstable in recent years. And I think one of the things that we can offer locally and in lots of kind of place-based organisations is some kind of stability and clarity around vision and purpose and all of those kind of things. So I was just hoping you could expand a bit on what you think the role of place-based organisations can and should be in kind of tackling some of the problems that you've described, and particularly what they can kind of be doing now and getting on with in the absence of sort of really strong national leadership in the same space.
I think Manchester feels like a really good example of the direction that would be good to see more generally, because the story that, as an outsider to Manchester, the story that I've seen developing over the last decade is of, some devolution, maybe not as much devolution as we'd like to see, but at least the arrow is going in the right direction. combined with kind of growing state or government capacity. And going back to what we were saying about we want empowered and connected places, but we also want places with the ability to do effective institution design, to gather the right kind of information, and to help coordinate the right investments. Those two things need to go hand in hand. It feels like the Manchester story is quite a good example of that because of the way things have been going. I share your view that we'd want to see more of that devolution and more of that growth, but I hope that's what the future will hold.
We'll see.
Yeah, so there's a question from Ken Jarbo, which is a question about intangibles. So early in your presentation, you mentioned in passing that intangibles can be divided into knowledge capital and relational capital. And I think this is an important point. But how do the two operationally differ, for example, in regard to the 4 S's, the S's that you identified?
I think that's, this is a good question. I think some of the aspects of the different types of intangible capital are basically the same. So, for example, the kind of relationships that underpin an effective supply chain, a type of relationship capital, can be scaled up to kind of putting more and more things through that supply chain. So it has that characteristic of scalability in the same way that knowledge capital does. I think the same, when I said there were 2 types, I didn't say that, I think I was more saying there's at least 2 types, because I would also add expressive capital as a type of, so, relational capital is about the social relationships between you and your supplier, or you and your workforce. Knowledge capital is clearly about informational assets, or informational assets that you create in the world or hold in your head. Some of these creative industry outputs are kind of primarily expressive. So the Harry Potter extended universe is in some ways an informational good because it's encoded information, but it's actually kind of expressive. The creative industry's content is expressive and in a way that is more important to the way that it's informational. And again, that kind of thing is scalable too. Similarly, all these types of capital are for the most part sunk. It's quite difficult to take over supply chain relationships except in fairly limited aspects. I guess there are some types of organizational capital, for example, within an investment within an organization that is less scalable. So scalability does vary to some extent, and software is kind of the most scalable. But on the whole, the 4 S's tend to apply to all of them.
I'd like to ask a question of my own, if that's possible. Take the opportunity. And you'll recognize this question because I'm sure I've asked you before. So you talked about the political challenges that face, if you like, upgrading the performance of the core cities. And clearly there are many political challenges, NIMBYism, etc. But some of the other things you talked about are the result of conscious decisions taken a long time ago that don't necessarily involve political challenges. So for instance, the deliberate decision taken in the 1980s to concentrate R&D and investment in the Golden Triangle through the formula that allocates QR, English QR, or the decision to deregulate buses, which is not really a political, not a vote-winning thing. But those things have all been institutionalized, and there are now vested interests that support those positions. And I guess my question is, how do we deal with the things that are not deep-seated kind of political or voter issues, but that are deeply institutionalized?
That's a really interesting question. I guess, so if we mean things where, I think there probably are some things where there isn't a lot of political capital required to spend to change things. This is just a question of priorities. And there I would say the message to government is intangible capital really matters. It's worth spending a bit of your bandwidth on this issue. I think but if we're talking about things where they weren't originally vote winners, but now there are real vested interests, one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is the fact that, well, if you want to do these kind of things, you probably just need to accumulate political capital and then spend it. And, there is a history of this kind of thing happening. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is, if you look at the story that Dominic Cummings tells of Brexit, clearly it's a controversial subject, but his own internal description of what he thought he was going on was spending or accumulating a bunch of political capital through the referendum campaign and then through the political occurrences of 2019 and the general election, and then spending it on radical institution change in the form of setting up things like ARIA. Now, there are a set of legitimate objections that one can make. You know, you could say that, well, the game wasn't worth a candle. You can say that the costs and benefits don't level up, but you can definitely see that you can see what game was trying to be played. And I think if we think more broadly about what governments do basically accumulate political capital from doing particular things and then spend them in other areas. And the task of politics, as opposed to political science, is to work out ways of accumulating political capital, to identify things that you think are worth doing and hoping that they're actually good things to do, and then finding ways of doing them that disperses as little of your political, or that preserves as much of your political capital as you can. So for me, I kind of think, well, that's their job. That's exactly what they're meant to be doing. So this is an attempt to say that in an intangible economy, these are some things that you might focus on.
Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. I mean, there I'm sure many other questions that people could ask. I mean, thank you so much. I thought that was a fantastic, lucid presentation. Lots of really outstanding questions that you identified as well. And I think some real practical policy lessons in there too. So thank you so much. I'll now hand over to Fiona to finish up.
So can I take this opportunity on behalf of the Business School and the University, thanks Stian and also Richard for facilitating the conversation. Some great conversations and questions here in the room, but also great to be able to include people online. So thank you, Kieran, for also bringing those questions forward. For those of you who are here, the upside of being here physically is that we will be offering you a drink outside in the mill, so that will be the opportunity to continue the conversation. And can I just use this opportunity to showcase our next event in AMBS? So a week on Thursday, the 27th of April, we'll be having our annual Grigor McClelland lecture. Grigor McClelland was our founding head of Alliance Manchester Business School and someone greatly committed to social responsibility, which of course is one of the core goals of the University of Manchester. So this year we're going to be joined by Laura Spence, who's a professor of business ethics at Royal Holloway, University of London, and currently a visiting academic at Said Business School at the University of Oxford. And the title of Laura's lecture is going to be Taking SME Seriously, Social Responsibility for the 99%. So very much hope that you will join us for that as well. So thank you very much again. Thank you.